So, Emily Dickinson, obviously in this moment she's actually writing about grief, but she was more complicated than that. She wrote over 1,800 poems, and she also, I think, had a sense of humour, but she did suffer a lot, and that's what this poem is really about. Just interestingly, while we're all in lockdown, I actually came across Emily Dickinson when I was in a sort of lockdown because I just had my appendix out, so I was quite limited in what I was able to do, and somebody sent me a book of poetry. And that's how I came to really love Emily Dickinson. So it's quite an interesting sort of comparison that I come full circle. I'm back in lockdown reading Emily Dickinson, but it also goes to show you never know what's going to happen with your experiences of reading a poet, of learning about a poet, and you might find that you really, really enjoy them. So this is a little poem that she did called, and it didn't even have a title actually, but it's called Faith is a Fine Invention for Gentlemen Who See, but Microscopes are Prudent in an Emergency. And I think it shows she's got a huge sense of humour, a huge amount of value to what she does. It's sort of poking fun at men a little bit, it's poking fun at the church, it's talking about science, and she was a very well-educated woman. I just wanted to bring up a silly little joke she's basically making about science and the church when we're talking about a woman in the 19th century, but also a poem that can be quite dark, to be honest. And so I'm really hoping that I get the chance to make you enjoy this poem as well as learn something today. So Emily Dickinson was born December 10th, 1830. She had a very traditional 19th century education, but it had a lot of scientific focus. And interestingly enough, she was educated at the same level as the men. So rather than her being given a domestic education, boys and girls were taught pretty much exactly the same. And so that was quite progressive. However, obviously men were able to go out and have different careers and do what they wanted with this learning. Women were expected then to become wives and mothers. So she actually said the words, God keep me from what they call households. She did not want to be a wife or a mother or work in the domestic world. That was not an experience she chose to have or wanted to have. She wasn't anti-religious, but she questioned religion. So she publicly, and she claimed it was joking, made her lack of Christianity known. But she might have just been doing it to mess with the expectations of women. She went to a seminary, so a religious school, and was categorised as being without hope. So it's safe to say that while she was aware of religion, it wasn't necessarily a large part of her life, while other members of her family were extremely devout. So back to the idea of her not being a fan of the life of a married woman, there's this brilliant poem that she wrote about what it is to be a wife. She rose to his requirement, dropped the playthings of her life to take the honourable work of woman and of wife. If aught she missed in her new day of amplitude or awe, or first perspective, or the golden using, where away, it lay unmentioned, as the sea developed pearl and weed, but only to himself be known the fathoms they abide. So today's lesson is not on this poem, but I think it's just interesting to note that basically the poem says you get married and you lose who you are. You don't have things, you don't have an identity, you're not a person. You rise to his requirements, you do what's required of him, of the husband. And it's quite a sad poem, really. It feels a bit mourning, a bit of an elegy. She doesn't get anything else, and literally only God knows what she did lose. So I think it shows she was quite confident in her anti-marriage opinions, or at least her lack of wanting one for herself. She said her friends are her estate. She didn't particularly want a family because of the requirements of domesticity, and then she lost a lot of friends and she lost a lot of family before she wrote this poem, and I think it deeply, deeply affected her. So she would say, my friends are my estate, they're my home, they're my people. So her two friends, Leonard Humphrey and Benjamin Newton, died. Her friend lost a child, Mary Bowles, stillborn, which is obviously incredibly sad, and her aunt died as well. So that was a lot of people, and however much in the 19th century death might have been more common for younger people, it was still incredibly traumatising, as it is for anybody. Just a side note, you can't find pictures of women in the 19th century, so this is a random image of a woman at a desk, but apparently there weren't enough of them to take photos of, so do not make the mistake of thinking that's Emily Dickinson. It's just an illustration, because you can't find the photos. So a lot of the time she's called a hermit or a recluse, and is sort of accused of being quite unfriendly, almost like there's something wrong with her. But actually, I think this poem, it's not about that. Neither is not this poem or her writing in general, the requirements socially of a woman of that era were that you had to do what's called paying calls. You had to go to other people's houses, sit with them, exchange news, exchange pleasantries, and they would come to your house the next day, and then you would go to their house. And it took up a lot of time. You've got to do 15-minute visits with 5 people who live all over the place. Basically, that was your entire life, that and running a household and telling the servants what to do. So she really couldn't be bothered, and she basically said, I'm not doing it, I'm not having it. That's not what I want to be a writer. So it wasn't necessarily that she was a recluse, she just refused to follow the expectations on her. She also did develop really bad eyesight in 1865, so that would have put a lot more demand on the time she could write for, presumably when it was lighter. She didn't join the church. A lot of her family, as I said, became born-again Christians and took part in revivals. She didn't. She still wanted to be a writer, but by joining this group of writers, she sort of entered this bohemian group who people were a bit suspicious of, who people thought were perhaps something to watch out for. They called her a libertine, which is another word for a socially or sexually immoral woman or person. So she was doing something quite unusual. She was going to be raising eyebrows, but of course she had the money to do that, to be independent like this. So you can make it up, you can decide for yourself, was she unfriendly and moody? Was she an artist who couldn't be bothered with all the things that normal people do? It's hard to say. Her style was rejected a lot as well. She wasn't quickly published. She got rejected several times, and it wasn't until 98 that a lot of the punctuation you're going to see in this poem actually was put back. It was heavily, heavily edited, so it's a lesson in knowing when something was written and when something needs to be read. Only then did all of it get put back in 1998, and bearing in mind she was born in 1830. It's a long time. Okay, let's read the poem. So, grief is compared to a passing away of summer. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away, too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. The quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature, spending with herself sequestered afternoon. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guest that would be gone. And thus, without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So it's a poem that's actually quite hard to get, I think, the first time round, and what we're going to do now is pull it apart and take it to pieces. But you're going to have to decide for yourself, is it a poem about grief and depression? Is it a poem about hope? And I'm going to try and show you all of those. So, as imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. So firstly, imperceptibly is something you hardly notice. You don't see it coming. It's imperceptible. It's barely there. And if something lapses, it expires or it runs out, like your driving license, for example, or a passport. So just like grief, the summer is creeping away. So just in the way that grief can sneak up on you, especially when a death is a surprise, but I think most people would say grief always sneaks up on you, whether you knew it was coming or not. And the summer lapses away. The summer is just sort of creeping out. Imagine those points where it starts just getting a little bit chillier, and then the leaves start going brown, and before you know it, it's the end of summer and you didn't realise. So the end of summer is a really common metaphor as well for passing of time and the coming of the winter. So does this summer lapsing away also suggest that death is coming? Very possibly, okay, apart from the continual Game of Thrones jokes that you can make here. So it was too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy. So perfidy is deceit, something we can't trust. So is Emily Dickinson saying here that the end of summer and the onset of her grief, has she been tricked? Or is it that it happened so quietly she can't believe she's been tricked? She might feel that the loss of her happiness is unfair, it's unjust. And so there's this sense of injustice here, how could this be happening? Why have I lost this person? It's a really interesting moment that she's actually sort of almost blaming somebody at this point. A quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. So if you distill something, you heat it or concentrate it to extract something, or possibly create almost a purer version. Now, interestingly, that's scientific language, like the scientific education she had, so she's using that in her writing to be creative. And sequestered, of course, means isolated or hidden away. So nature's hiding as well. So first thing here is that the quietness is distilled. The absence of her friends is so much that she herself feels the quietness is overwhelming. It's like the ultimate quiet. She's trapped in twilight, and it's been going on for ages. So she can't get to the light. She can't get to the dark. It's the in-between period in the day, and it's always there. There's no day, there's no night for her. She can't escape it. She's, I think, becoming quite numb at this point and quite trapped in her own grief. And then nature is personified, which is a very, very common thing to do. Everything from Moana to A Midsummer Night's Dream personifies nature as a woman in some form, but it's hidden. It's spending with herself sequestered afternoons, and nature's hiding away as well. And of course, with the onset of winter and the end of summer, we've got a time when crops aren't growing, when things are dying. It's never necessarily a particularly pleasant time, but especially if you think about a culture that was much more ruled by the seasons before kind of mass farming and greenhouses. This is an even more seriously depressing time, actually. So nature itself is hiding from the winter and is experiencing this grief. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone. So darkness is drawing in here, and it's coming sooner as well. And then the morning is described as foreign, which in this case we're talking about it as alien, something she can't recognise or understand. So that hope of a new day, the idea, oh, everything will get better, not for her, because she can't recognise that hope. She can't take it in. It's foreign to her. So darkness is drawing in. She can't escape. I love this bit. A courteous yet harrowing grace as guest that would be gone. So courteous means polite. Harrowing, really, really upsetting. But what's interesting is this capital letter on the G here. And what that suggests is you've got the noun grace. And I think she's talking about religious grace there. So there's this opportunity for religious hope, for thinking about her friends in heaven, for taking, some succor from that feeling. And it's come to her honestly and openly, but she can't take it. She cannot accept religion or any kind of hope. If she wants it gone, it's literally a guest she wants out of the house. And the fact that it's harrowing, religion is quite interesting, because of course she's talking about it as if it must be comforting. But it's harrowing, it's traumatizing. It's that bad for her. And yeah, this is what I've written here. Her grief is so complete, even something like the grace of God is painful and frightening. And she needs that gone. So she's really falling into her pain at this point. And thus, without a wing or service of a keel. So a keel is part of a boat that helps keep it stable and upright. And obviously birds use wings as well to stabilize themselves in flight, but she doesn't have either of those things. She doesn't have anything that will keep her stable. She almost metaphorically might fall over. She can't stand upright. She can't take care of herself in the way she needs to. It's also interesting to note that obviously birds are quite religious imagery. They're often used to symbolize the Holy Spirit or souls going up to heaven. They often have that sort of place. People release doves at certain ceremonies, and obviously a boat as well is a kind of a classic association with a journey, with moving on, with going somewhere. She can't do that. She doesn't have the ability because she doesn't have the keel or the wing. So I think she's drawing on kind of very common imagery, but she's flipping it. She's not able to make those journeys, to find that redemption, to find that hope. She is unstable. And the final line, all of a sudden, everything gets better. Our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So summer's making a light escape. Summer hasn't had to fight its way out or dig holes or trek tunnels. It's gone. She's been able to accept time passes, people die, summer ends, but it will come back as well. And so all of a sudden, Lord knows how, Emily Dickinson is able to find acceptance of this grief and accept possibly even that there is an afterlife, because the beautiful is also capitalised here, as with grace, and that is generally assumed to be heaven. to some form of heaven. So whether she's going to heaven or she's accepting that it does exist and that there is hope for her friends is a matter for debate. But time is going to pass, and she's accepted that, and she's able to escape this, trapped in this twilight before. Now summer's ended in the way it was supposed to. It's not hiding, it's not gone, it's escaped into the beautiful, and it will be back. So it's a really beautiful, hopeful ending, but preceded by a lot of really, really dark grief. So I'm going to read it again, but we're going to look at the structure. As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away, too imperceptible at last to seem like perfidy, a quietness distilled as twilight long begun, or nature spending with herself sequestered afternoon. The dusk drew earlier in, the morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guests that would be gone. And thus, without a wing or service of a keel, our summer made her light escape into the beautiful. So these stanzas are very even-lined. She's not playing around with particularly sophisticated structures. However, I think that in itself is important, because she's not calm accepting in a kind of Zen yoga way. She's calmly accepting that she's grief-stricken. She's too grief-stricken to be writing fancy writing styles. She's not capable of that at the moment. She's just expressing herself. So there's a calmness, but that definitely doesn't mean relaxed. It just means it's all she's capable of. I feel like she's just doing the bare minimum with her grief in terms of how much she's able to write. So there is rhyme, but it's very, very disjointed. There's only one moment of rhyme I've noticed, unless you really start to overinterpret. And it's here. The morning foreign shone, a courteous yet harrowing grace, as guests that would be gone. So those two words rhyme, but given that there is absolutely no other rhyme scheme in this poem, I think what she's trying to do there is show the disjointed thoughts of the author. She may have written these even-lined stanzas, but she can't stick to a rhyme scheme. She's not capable of that, because this poem isn't about beautiful rhyme and beautiful sound. It's about her being trapped in grief and depression and not being able to see a way out. And so I think, again, we're seeing the chaos of her thoughts and the lack of connection with anything beautiful, with anything rhythmic, with anything pleasant. She can't see the morning. She's not going to give us a bouncy rhyme scheme. The dashes are really interesting. She loved the dash. She loved to use them as a pause, as a technique. And they arguably represent her grief. If you think about trying to speak when you're crying and that hitching and the fact that you can't get past what you're saying, I think those dashes are reflective of that, because they're very, very uneven. There's 2 in the first stanza, 1 in the second, 3 in the penultimate one in the third. So I think it shows sort of the disjointed nature of how she's thinking as well, the chaos of her thoughts. Again, she's not sticking to a rhyme scheme or any kind of rhythm, and that in itself shows us how confused and how sad she is. It's worth noting, however, that there are none in this final stanza in which she makes her escape, in which she finds hope again, and I think that's because her thoughts calm down. So there's this hopeful ending. There is life after death and grief, and she's really able to finally accept that, but only after this fascinating, chaotic, disorganised examination of what her grief actually is. Okay, so I hope that's been really, really helpful. I hope you've maybe even enjoyed Emily Dickinson. That would be lovely to know. Just remember, this poem's got so much imagery in it, but essentially it is a poem where the end of summer, the coming of winter, and all the death that includes in terms of nature and plants is grief for her. It's the death of everything that was alive. It's the death of hope. But there is always hope. There is life after grief and death, however you choose to interpret that. And you can do that even without the stability of wing or a keel. I think it's quite a modern poem in that sense. She's saying, actually, without this help, I still found my way out of my pain, and you can too. So basic key ideas. Summer, the end of summer represents grief. It's a poem about grief as she moves through that transition period, but it's also a poem about hope, and that you can, generally speaking, she's saying you can escape grief in your own time, and that's okay. Hope that was helpful. Hope you found Emily Dickinson a little bit more than maybe what you expected. I don't know. Thank you very much for listening.